Dr. Ersin Hussein is currently a senior lecturer of classics at Swansea University in Wales, whose work focuses on Roman history, local identity formation in the Roman provinces, and receptions of Cyprus and the Cypriot identity from antiquity to the present. She has recently published her first monograph with Oxford University Press called Revaluing Roman Cyprus, Local Identity on an Island in Antiquity. And she's here with us today to discuss Cyprus during the Roman period. Ersin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you for inviting me to take part in today's session.
Oh, you're very welcome. So I just want to start off with your book and the title that you chose. It's clear that you put a lot of thought into the title of your book, Revaluing Cyprus. So what is it that you actually set out to do?
Well, I obviously wanted to make it really clear what the premise of the book was, and what it really is it's a reconsideration of Roman Cyprus as a landscape, really using Terence Bruce Mitford's study Roman Cyprus, which is an article over 100 pages long that was published posthumously in 1980, and to use that as a springboard really to really champion Cyprus as a really valuable and significant case study for the culture and society of provincial life in Roman territories. And I think really what happened with Terence Bruce Mitford's work, Roman Cyprus, is it became this really important standard for the study of Cypriot history. But it really did need to be revisited and updated. And what I found was that the article itself is wonderful in addressing concisely so many different themes and topics that tell us about the political situation of the island at the time. So during the very early Mediterranean history, from the hangover of the Ptolemaic period, and then rolling into when the Romans come in, take over, assume Cyprus as part of their territories, and then what happens from there. But what it did, like many other studies of its time, is that it really assessed the culture and society of the island, standing from Rome and from those other important hubs central to Roman history. So you get a real minimization of the impact of the culture and society of the island at that time. What I wanted to do was to reevaluate the different aspects of the island's history and society, but standing from the viewpoint where I'm in Cyprus and looking outwards, so you can get a greater sense of the nuances and think much more deeply about those connections that the island maintained once it became part of the Roman territories. And I hope at least that really comes through in the book, particularly when we're talking about that really big topic, identity and identity formation.
Right. So as a historian, Cyprus surprisingly has a lack of written sources for this period, and that's got to be frustrating. So how do we fill in those gaps? How have you filled in those gaps?
Oh, absolutely, Andreas. You've absolutely hit the nail on the head. What really happens during the Roman period is we get written sources that emerge that include really impressionistic snapshots at best of Cypriot culture and society during that time. And what we really have are outsider perceptions of what's important or what they deem as important concerning the island and its history. Less so its people. Even if written sources were in abundance generally, I think it's always important to remember that they must be approached with caution, because authors would have had their own motives, and the way that they create and maintain stories about landscapes and peoples in the distant past will always be written to suit their cultural outlooks and aims. So there's even if we had a wealth of sources, we'd have to be really critical of what it is they're saying. And I hope we cover this a little bit more when we sort of move on with our conversation. But with regards filling in the gaps and getting a sense of what maybe daily life was like, or what it was like for communities in Cyprus, we really have to synthesize a range of materials. So that includes epigraphic data. So That means those large monuments, sort of inscriptions attached to buildings, pedestals, statue bases, to much smaller finds as well. Coins, art, architecture, and the landscape itself, and other types of material culture. And these need to all obviously come from different contexts, so from domestic, public, funerary, and so on. But there are always challenges with interpreting these as well. And there's so much to contend with when you're engaging with material culture. This must go hand in hand with the study of the few written accounts that do survive.
Mm-hmm.
The other big challenge, of course, is recovering marginalized voices in the ancient world, and this is a given for any aspect of ancient society, and in particular with Cyprus. What I did find was that the experiences of women, children, and slaves are really minimized in the evidence. We know very, very little about those. The thing that we are fortunate with ancient Cyprus, particularly its Roman period, is that there's a rich history of archaeological excavation and collaboration across the island. So we get a really nice sense of settlement archaeology and site history. So through systematic excavation. So we get a nice sense of different turns that settlements take over time. So sites like Nea Paphos, Palais Paphos,
Mm-hmm.
Kourion, Amathus, Kition, and Salamis really yield rich evidence, rich data relating to the culture and society of the island under Roman rule, as well as its other periods.
Right, because most of these sites, when we visit them, what we see, what we interact with, generally speaking, are dated to the Roman period.
Yes.
Okay.
We have what we see is in some sites in particular, really intense moments of restructuring and rebuilding. There's lots of reasons for this. One, of course, is that Cyprus is an earthquake hotspot, it still is. So we have these moments where that restoration really is quite important. But it's also an opportunity for, in commas, the great good of society. So there's wealthy elites to show off and
Mm-hmm.
to show that they're great benefactors of their own cities where they hail from, and that their families are important, and that they can pull rank and
Mm-hmm.
outshine one another. And it's also the places where governors or like high-ranking Roman officials and the emperor himself can have monuments set up to show that relationship between the center and periphery, and
Mm-hmm.
maintain a particular dynamic between the capital and the province itself.
Now, you actually mentioned that islands are often imagined as representing isolation, exile, danger,
Yeah.
and in other ways, they're imagined as romantic backwaters.
Mhm.
Where does Cyprus fit in this imperial imagination, and how often does the pendulum swing?
The pendulum swings back and forth a lot, I can tell you. There's quite a lot to say really on this point, because it is true to say that islands are paradoxical landscapes. They really are set apart from other types of landscape for that reason. They are insular, they are isolated, but they're highly connected at the same time, and we see this flux playing out in lots of different ways. So we certainly get that sense of it being a contradictory landscape, and it's imagined so in the Roman imperial imagination. So certainly when we think about those Roman works that present us with accounts of the island, and I've mentioned that they're impressionistic snapshots, they're incredibly derivative, and they tend to crystallize what I sort of see as a transmission of ideas about the island that emerge really from, at least in written sources, from the 8th century BC onwards. And we really get this compressed impression of key symbols and ideas that have been generated and disseminated as important and significant to its identity, not just by outsiders, but by insiders along the way. So by Cypriots in much earlier period, certainly.
Hmm.
And the key markers that we see propping up in these accounts really are on the island's unusualness, the weirdness of its cults, particularly the worship of Aphrodite, of which there is a lot to say. It's very exciting to talk about her worship on the island. And of course, its abundant resources. It's synonymous with copper, so its excellent reserves absolutely were exploited by all and sundry, and its abundant forests and other types of resources that make it really profitable and wealthy and beneficial to control, essentially.
Yeah. My last question for this, for your approach to Cyprus is, and specifically dealing with your book, you mentioned in the intro that you were using Benedict Anderson's work as a springboard, who was famous for his work on identity and imagined communities. And while he focuses on nationalism, you write that, and I quote, many of his observations and qualifiers are useful for this study. So, how do we understand Cypriot identity through those lenses that you've chosen?
Yes, I have to admit my the way in which I present my engagement with Benedict Anderson's work, Imagined Communities, in the introduction is lighter than I would like it to be. But I think it's an incredibly useful point of departure when thinking about identity formation and communities and how community looks in the distant past and of course up to the present day as well. Particularly when thinking about cultural markers that articulate identity formation and represent those ancient communities. And what really struck me was his discussion about the reality that many people can genuinely feel connected to one another or to a cause, or to a landscape, or build a sense of community, even though they might never meet each other or even know of each other's existence. And there's something that brings those people together emotionally or physically somehow. And it might be something like seeing a flag or seeing a symbol that represents or is universal across their landscape or their community, or doing something like singing a national anthem. I think those are some of the examples he
Yeah.
draws upon. So I started thinking, using this as a way to frame or think about how we might interpret those symbols that prop up quite regularly in different corners of Cypriot culture and society, to think about how people might feel connected or even feel a sense of differentiation or distance or dissonance, because of course those things I've mentioned, I'm using as an example singing a national anthem or looking at a flag, that can stir up negative emotions as
Yeah.
well, of course, as we all know. So when I was thinking collectively about those key symbols, so for me we've got Aphrodite and her associated, mythological figures that prop up in her, stories about her and the Cypriot landscape, the religious landscape as well, as it's imagined and constructed by insiders, so Cypriots, through the use of symbols, and then how that's interpreted by outsiders, so people who might have never stepped foot on the island, but they're writing about it, and those sources have survived and tell us about those snapshots. And what I found, or how I interpreted this, was that we see these moments where we see those big markers bringing people together, or they would have been familiar symbols, but we also see nuances as well. So we see local interpretations of what these are and what it means to a community. So for me, it helped me sort of understand and framework and interpret how identity in the ancient world, as much as it is in the modern world, is fluid, it's
Hmm. Of course.
situational,
Yeah.
it's practical. You lean into whatever and you utilize whatever identity or symbol or marker that is relevant to the context in which you're operating in at that given time. And of course it's evolving. Nothing is ever static and still.
Right.
There's we constantly see movement.
Yeah, I've had this conversation around identity countless times, and it never ceases to amaze me how often when we speak about identity, we think of it as something that's encoded in your DNA, and it's
Mhm.
and it's
Yes.
not, right? It, it
Hmm.
it's not in your blood. It's not something that you can um, test for as much as those DNA kits want to
Oh,
sell you on, right?
yes.
Um, okay, so let's jump into the putting this into political context, historical context.
Yeah.
In the Ptolemaic era, there are significant changes in Cypriot history. There's a period of Hellenization. So we have the
Hmm.
abolition of the quote unquote city kingdoms,
Yes.
standardization of Koine Greek, and in 58 BCE, we have Rome's annexation of Cyprus.
Yes.
I want to start off by trying to wrap my head around what was the Roman motivation to annex Cyprus from Egypt.
Oh, there is. Oh, this is such an exciting period of Mediterranean history to observe for me, anyway. And with regards to the motivation, we really need to focus on the key movers and shakers at Rome at the time. And I'm particularly talking about Clodius Polka, who was tribune of the plebs in 58 BC. Now, this might be a bit of a scattergun result, but he's at the center of all of this, and there's a few sort of strands of this story with regards what he does to facilitate the and push forward with the annexation of the island. What's really significant about this moment in Roman history in particular is that the empire of not the empire, its territories, rather, it's not an empire yet, its territories are expanding, and we're seeing generally in the eastern Mediterranean that systematically it's assimilating landscapes under its, into its control. And on the one hand, we have people who sort of think, okay, well, it's inevitable, Cyprus is next. But it's an island that is attached to the Ptolemies, who are ruling predominantly from Alexandria, but they themselves are managing a failing thalassocracy, so they're losing their grip on power. And at key moments in that sweep of the first century BC, where we see Rome expanding its territories in different parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, we see the Ptolemies really bargaining and negotiating to hang on to their status. And they're doing this through various means. And one thing, of course, that happens is that they're paying lots of money. Some of their leaders are paying lots of money to establish and confirm their status and that relationship with Rome. Then we fast forward to 58 BC. Pulcher is tribune of the plebs, and he pushes forward with this law known as the Lex Claudia. And one of the things that is stipulated in this is that the property of Ptolemy of Cyprus, so this is the brother of one of the leading Ptolemies in Alexandria, that he is ruling in Cyprus, and the law stipulates that his property should be confiscated from him and assumed by Rome, essentially. And there's another little offshoot to this story that, prior to this, Clodius, was kidnapped by pirates, and a ransom was announced, and Ptolemy of Cyprus sent such a pitiful sum of money for him to be released that it was a humiliation. So some interpret it as some sort of personal vendetta. Some see the wider picture of Egypt, and its rulers are simply just losing their grip on power, and it's inevitable that Cyprus was next to fall under Rome's control, given what's happening elsewhere. But really, what we should really see this as is as being driven by the greed and the demands and the needs of those key players of Roman politics back in Rome. And of course, we see all of this, or most of it, through the lens of Cicero, who is, Polka's great adversary, and he will sort of counter anything that Polka does or says.
Yes,
Um,
Cicero. He's really. I'm from what I gather. I'm from what I've read, he's really really critical of
Oh,
him and
absolutely.
his interactions with not just Ptolemy, but I think he criticizes even some. I think he calls it exploitation of the Salaminians.
Yes,
Some really
absolutely.
dark stuff. Maybe you can touch upon it. Even locking some Salaminians in a local Senate house,
Yes.
starving five of them to death,
Yeah.
allegedly.
Yep. But again, you're absolutely right to point that out. And I think we do have to look at what it is that these men back in Rome wanted to portray of themselves and wanted to achieve, and what their wider motives were. And Cyprus, it finds itself at the center of all of this. These internal quarrels. The other issue, of course, is that following years and years and years of warfare and expansion, there's the treasury at Rome is absolutely dwindling, and with the confiscation of property comes great booty, doesn't it? So it's this key turning point in Roman politics, and how they manage, and negotiate relationships with different landscapes. And it's this moment where they don't just go down and kick the door down to start a war. There's a bit of hanging back first. Cato the Younger is sent out there, and he hangs back in Rhodes first of all, and his job of confiscating the property is made all the more easier because Ptolemy of Cyprus commits suicide. He's offered the high priesthood of Aphrodite of Paphos, and he sort of makes that decision to take control of the situation, and that's how he deems to do that. And what happens is then Cato the Younger is then able to hot tail it from Rhodes and go to Cyprus, and then he spends 2 years essentially overseeing the sale of property and land and amassing great wealth. And he does return to Rome in 56 BC with unimaginable wealth from the island. Some of it's lost on the way, conveniently, but there's still an incredible amount of wealth that is amassed from the island.
Jump ahead to 47, 48 BCE.
Yes.
Julius Caesar actually returns Cyprus to Cleopatra, and I've actually encountered this little factoid as as being a romanticized event, like
Yes.
that he gifted it to Cleopatra to about Cyprus's beauty to match her own and all that
Mhm.
kind of stuff. But what was the reason really? Why was this gifted back to Cleopatra?
In truth, I don't know. The sources are really not that clear on that. They're pretty vague on it, to be
Really?
honest.
Yeah.
I think what we can at least take from that, we can take other things from that specific interaction. One, it gives us a sense of really the dire situation for the Ptolemies. Cleopatra VII is the last Ptolemy standing, and of course, with her death marks the end of the Ptolemies themselves as a dynasty. And really her interactions with Rome in the wake of those of her ancestors immediately give us that sense of how dire the situation was, as I've said, for the Alexandrians, trying to maintain their sense of power and importance, as they're failing, and as a unit of power and sway in that region at the time. And she's essentially bargaining with Rome, and standing her ground as much as she can. And it's interesting, you think about, you've raised that interesting point about romanticizing this interaction. We certainly get that connectivity between this image of Cleopatra VII as being matched by the beauty of Aphrodite, and that link with the island. After the birth of Caesarion, so the child that she has with Julius Caesar, a coin is, a series is minted, and we see them represented on the coin itself as Aphrodite and as Eros or Cupid. So we sort of get that, that sense of that playing on those symbols there, and showing the connectivity between her as a ruler and a leader, and then she's been connected with the chief deity of the island itself. And then we get this later symbolic handing back or handing of Cyprus and other territories in the Ptolemaic orbit at the time, when she is with Mark Antony, and has children with him as well. So it's showing us really how unstable that region is at the time, and what the key figures are doing to try and hang on to power and carve their ground out and hang on to it.
So in 22 BCE, the island is officially returned to senatorial rule, if I'm not mistaken. But what I want to know is, well, two questions, and I think they're both sort of big, so I apologize that they're not a little bit more focused. The first one is, the Roman period seems to begin with the draining of the Cypriot treasury and selling off land, just like you mentioned a moment ago. But ironically, this is what I was mentioning earlier, it does seem to usher in a period of prosperity and drastically transforming the cityscape. So I suppose my first question is, how long does it take for prosperity to sort of take hold in Cyprus? And in what way do we see this growth of prosperity that eventually comes through the Roman period?
In terms of how long we see prosperity, it's really hard to. I don't like to give this impression ever when it comes to history that as we move on through different periods of time, there's sort of an evolution and an upward tick of things, because things are very, it's very different in terms of how settlements grow and how the people or those ruling it benefit from it and make gains from it, or see their culture and society move in different directions. So I really hope that my response doesn't give any sense of straightforward linear progression. I think that the thing about with the island being drained of its resources, the key through the sale of key lands and properties, I think the key thing to note is that the sense I get from the written texts are that these are exclusively the property of Ptolemy. So those individuals or communities or groups that have emerged as prominent in society continue to grow, essentially. The challenge is that we don't necessarily have specifics about who these people were and when they were operating and what they were doing, because of the nature and focus of epigraphic evidence, which is really the type of evidence that gives us a sense of those specifics to do with family groups and different individuals. So certainly generally from the inscriptions that I've seen and studied from the Ptolemaic period, they've certainly centered more on the Ptolemies themselves and people close to their court, who tended to be outsiders, not local Cypriots during their reign. But we certainly have evidence of families and family groups way back before the Roman period, sort of holding, prominent positions in society that were important to their local context. And I think this really relates to the religious landscapes of different types of priesthoods, that type of thing. So we must imagine that they were a big deal locally in very small local settings at the time. But when we think about that prosperity and what happens after Roman rule sort of is established, we certainly see, I think the evidence that we see of families being celebrating themselves, and certainly being honoured by locals who might not have citizenship or hold high rank at all. I think that tends to speak to the general trend that we see in the Roman world of inscriptions being that really important source for people to record their actions and deeds and be remembered for time afterwards. So there's a famous study of inscriptions in the Roman world, and it talked by Ramsay MacMullen, and it talks about the trends that we see in the use of inscriptions as an important communicative memorial tool, essentially. So that, we're seeing inscriptions as really important in the Roman period, and we really get a sense of these family dynamics in the key hubs, key settlements of the island at the time, and what they're up to, and the important roles that they played in their local communities.
Yeah, I guess the reason why I asked that question was because when you do visit Cyprus, you do see the bulk of the remains that you see do date to the Roman period, and I feel that you can sort of qualify quote unquote prosperity
Yeah,
in terms of mosaics and public
yeah,
buildings and so on and so forth, which is why I suppose I thought of it in that way, that this is a period where we see public works and aqueducts,
yes,
and it just strikes me as like, oh, is this a time where there's a lot of money being brought into Cyprus and a lot of investment and public works that must be benefiting not just the rich but also the poor classes that we don't get to really see in the historical record. If that makes any sense,
yes.
what I said.
No, you're absolutely right to flag that. And if I may, just to give one example. I mean, one thing that's really interesting is that we don't actually know what these people are doing to get their wealth. But there's one figure that really stands out, and I'd like to mention him. He's from Salamis. There are, I think, over 17 or around 17 or a little over 17 inscriptions, that name this individual. And his name is Servius Sulpicius Pancles Veranianus. And he is an incredible benefactor for Salamis. And there's actually one inscription set up by someone who identifies as an ancestral friend. And this person talks about all the public works that this individual has set up for the community. And, he builds the amphitheater and the theater, and he sets up statues representing the emperors, and they're made of precious metals. And he gives a handout to the community. And I don't have, there's no firm evidence for this, but there's a really interesting idea presented in David Potter's study of Roman Cyprus. And he says, well, someone like Pancles, he must have been benefiting from ancient institutions and making money from things like slavery. Surely, these are the types of things that perhaps people were gaining wealth from. And of course, there are other things. If you think about Cyprus's situation as an island, it's a connecting node really in the Eastern Mediterranean, really important in terms of its location between East and West, and of course, situated between Asia Minor and, of course, Egypt to its south. So people would have, of course, been taking advantage of the trade and trade routes. So there's lots of things that are not explicit, but we could certainly inch towards some answers by, it doesn't do any harm to pose questions, even
Mhm.
though we don't have the firm evidence.
This is the second question I had. Unfortunately, I think it's one of those one of those really big ones again. What sort of changes do we see between the Ptolemaic and the Roman rule? And they could be cultural changes, economic changes. If we could maybe get a sense of what sort of changes occurred between these two periods, that maybe we can qualify.
There's things that change, and there's things that don't change at all. So I think this is a great question, because it really speaks to the overall message of my work that focuses on this period of the island's history. There's a lot that changes, and I certainly see it as a veneer as opposed to a deep rooted change. And when I say there's a lot that changes, I'm thinking of things like, of course, we get the hallmarkers of Roman culture and society that show that the community leaned into being part of the Roman Empire and did their best really to negotiate a relationship where with their rulers, so through their administrators, and then to try and reach centrally to really benefit from being part of this system. And there's a few things that give us that sense. And one is, of course, the way in which the towns are furnished. So physically, we sort of see those outward signs. So through inscriptions, monuments that are set up to the emperor, be it whether he's conceived of as divine or mortal. So what's really wonderful is we get a very positive response outwardly. So it's not just in, monuments that we see set up, but also when we look at those individuals that I've mentioned or alluded to earlier, those prominent families. And we get a real mix of people, whether they hold citizenship or not, sort of really celebrating the emperor with great zeal and zest. We've got these people setting up all kinds of things and making sure that the emperor's honored at festivals and that there are statues set up to him. So we see that happening and we see that enthusiasm, but we always have to think, what is the motivation here? And this is where I sort of see it, why I sort of see it as a veneer. And I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to mention the really one of the most important documents to come from the island, and that is the oath of allegiance to Tiberius. This, just in brief, is a monument that whereby the island or the community is swearing an oath of allegiance to the emperor, and of course flagging up that they're going to hold the same enemies as he does, and they're going to sort of acknowledge him as a divine being and swear loyalty to him. But the other thing is, whilst they're doing this, the Cypriots say, hang on, we are the home, we are the land of your divine ancestress Aphrodite, and they flag this up in the inscription. So that's one thing that's really important about this document. And the other thing that is important is that heading the document is a list of really local and obscure gods and goddesses, and some of them we don't actually know from any other documents. So we have, Apollo Hylates, who is a very local god, the chief god of Koinon. We have another Apollo with an uncertain epithet that follows. So an Aphrodite Acraia, so from the tip of Cyprus, the saucepan handle, if it were. So the Cypriots, it's a really nice document to respond to your question, because on the one hand, they do a lot on the surface to say, we're embracing being part of the Roman Empire, but they are maintaining their local identity and they're not compromising it in any way. And those are the deep-rooted ties that we see lasting, outlasting Roman rule. And that they run deep. So we see, when we look closer at the evidence, we see that celebration and sense of connectivity with its neighboring landscapes in that Eastern Mediterranean region, and of course touching the central Mediterranean as well. So I'm thinking about the particular connection it has with landscapes like Greece, mainland Greece, so particularly Athens and Crete, Tegea. So for me, those outlast and they trump what we see happening with the Romans coming in. So I hope that answers your question. There's plenty more to flag up.
Okay, so we have Cato, Titus, Galen, possibly Trajan, Hadrian,
Yes.
a lot of visitors to Cyprus. Did Romans stay in Cyprus at all? Did they settle in any way?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, I remain skeptical about Trajan and Hadrian setting foot on the island. Certainly, we have evidence of the other people and more that you mention. Another high-profile visitor is Marcia, she is a close relative of the Emperor Augustus, and her husband Paulus Fabius Maximus was a proconsul locally, so not of Cyprus, but he was proconsul elsewhere. And we've got an inscription set up at the sanctuary of Aphrodite, Paphia at Paphos, noting her presence somehow. But even then, I think I sort of make a note that, well, She might have visited on a tour to the island, tour of the region. But again, is this a way in which the Cypriots set up a monument to give that impression that someone important visited? Question mark. And that's certainly the discussion around the potential visit of Trajan or Hadrian. So again, thinking about the type of impressions that these inscriptions give, when they're set up by local communities, what's going on here. In terms of whether the Romans stayed and settled, there's no firm evidence of this. Unfortunately, there's certainly no colonies set up on the island, but you certainly get a sense of the administration of the island being pretty unproblematic and pretty efficient.
Apart from the one incident
Oh
that we
yes.
have, the Jewish revolt,
Oh
where
yes.
supposedly the numbers are incredible. 200,000 Cypriots were killed in this revolt, which I really doubt that number. I think most people do.
It's just dramatic devices, isn't it, in literary text for that shock factor.
Yeah.
But I mean, the figure that you're mentioning comes from Cassius Dio, who's writing about that empire-wide Jewish revolt that took place in the early part of the 2nd century AD, so between AD 115 and 117. And again, that figure of over 200, he says 240,000 Greeks were killed by the Jewish community during an uprising that took place in AD 117. This then prompted Trajan to dispatch a legion to quash the revolt and restore peace. But again, this is one of those moments when we have to look at the wider picture to think about what is exactly going on here. So you've got these sensationalist figures and accounts, and it goes on to say that the Jewish people who lived there, they were cannibals. So it's really, really, awful depictions of a community that just speaks to the wider marginalization of them, not just in this source, but in other sources. So I can give us other examples. There's Pliny the Elder, who writes about magic and sorcery that takes place, that originates with Jews and connects that with some aspects of Cyprus. And of course, the Acts of the Apostles, book 13, which tells us of Christian and Jewish encounters on the island. We have a Jewish sorcerer there being presented in a particularly negative light, and this speaks to a wider narrative. But this is the one example where we have things going not very well on Cyprus that sort of prompts a dramatic response from Rome.
So, how would have Cypriots identified themselves at the time? Are they still primarily seeing themselves through the polis?
I think so, yes. I mean, I say yes because when I looked at what Cypriots are doing outside of the island, we don't have many inscriptions, but we certainly have examples of Cypriots in key hubs moving around. We see them at Athens, we see them at Delphi, participating in games. We get lots of poets, athletes. So they're really, particularly under Roman rule, they're really participating in those different processes and cultural events of the wider empire. We see them in Rome as well, quite a few examples from there. But the key thing is that when they're being commemorated in their inscriptions, more often than not, they name their polis. There's very few examples where they say from or of Cyprus. It's really the polis that comes through. So I think that's the identity that is that's the community that they see themselves being part of. And of course, as much as we're talking about Cyprus as a connected landscape, the cities themselves enjoyed that sense of competition amongst one another, and they had their own deep-rooted ties and connections with different landscapes that we sort of get that as a hangover from different periods of the island's history, going way back to their supposed foundations and how those are imagined and reimagined over time. And then just to circle back your question about what changes and what stays the same between Ptolemaic rule and Roman rule. Just thinking of some of those markers of Ptolemaic culture and society and its impact on Cyprus, we still see that continuing, certainly in the Roman period. I mean, there were at one point, multiple calendars allegedly being utilized on the island. We've got Neopaphos that sets up and establishes a new calendar in around 15 BC that's really geared up towards celebrating Rome and incorporating Roman names and ideas and gods and goddesses in its landscape. But got fragments of or snapshots of calendars being used in other locations like Salamis and their Ptolemaic. We've got peculiarities of cults that have quite close contact with these different landscapes, and those traits and symbols and markers of identity, they continue in the Roman period. So we get a real mixed bag, certainly, to say the least.
I was really surprised when I was reading your book to learn about trading communities from Italy at the
Yes.
time. And they're referred to as, now in English, looking at this word, I would say negotiator, but I don't know that that's exactly how it would have been pronounced. So you can clarify a little bit. But what was that group exactly? And what were their function in Cyprus?
Yeah, they're this is the evidence for them is thin, I have to admit, and it's always risky putting that kind of data into print. But they were certainly there in Cyprus. So negotiators or negotiatores. There's no singular definition of really what they did or who they were when we find evidence relating to them. But they were predominantly involved in the work of publicani. So that's public contractors. It's not necessarily nice work to be doing because, and when I say not nice work, you'll see what I mean by this description, because they were essentially responsible for collecting taxes and dues, amongst other things. So as you can imagine, this is sort of quite intense, involving quite intense dynamics in communities. And often when we turn to the evidence for them in different hubs of the Mediterranean, we find that they did assimilate and ingratiate themselves in some communities, but there were also lots of tensions as well. So as I said, the evidence for them in Cyprus is admittedly quite scarce. We have certainly 2 inscriptions that name them. One really full inscription from the Sanctuary of Aphrodite at Paphos, which is wonderful. Very early in date when it comes to those interactions between Rome and Cyprus. So potentially in the 2nd century BC, I think, but there are some ideas that it's dated a little bit later than that. And there's a very fragmentary inscription from Salamis. And then there's another inscription from Neopaphos. And what we have is we don't have the wealth of evidence that we have in other locations such as Delos. So we don't have specific names. We don't really get a sense of really what they're up to. And we don't really know what they're doing there or what their community looked like. What we can glean from the monuments that do stand is that we get a real sense of how they're marking their identities in these different contexts in different ways. So just to turn to the 2 firm examples, for instance, we've got the one from the Sanctuary of Aphrodite Paphos, so Aphrodite Paphia at Paphos, and this is a bilingual inscription. So there's a sense, I imagine, I guess, of honouring local traditions and the goddess. So it's, we've got the text in Greek, but we've also got it in Latin as well. And then we've got the text in Latin in Salamis. So are they using language as a vehicle to really make a bold statement that they're, on the one hand, assimilating and following customs or following traditions in one context, and in another, that's not a concern. They're making it clear that they are Roman, they're from, and they're using language as a signifier to do so. With that 2nd inscription from Salamis comes fragments of Roman terminology and Roman names as well. So it's very different in tone to the other inscription. But as I say, that it's really hard to know specifically what they're doing there.
Yeah, which is goes back to our, if we only had some written sources to kind
Yeah.
of shore up
Yes.
the evidence that we have already. To what degree can we say there was bilingualism in Cyprus?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the interesting thing with languages and what happens in Cyprus really isn't remarkable in any way whatsoever. Generally speaking, when it comes to landscapes that came under Roman control, that were in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, the daily language was Greek. They tended to continue inscribing in Greek, and we see that happening more often than not. But then official documents that come from the center were in Latin, or they were bilingual. So we have a lovely series of milestones from the Roman period, and they're bilingual. So that's really wonderful to see that and get a sense of those boundary markers setting out the Cypriot landscape with both languages side by side. There's also an idea in some contexts that Phoenician was still in use at a domestic level, at least into the first century BC. That's an idea that comes from Terence Bruce Mitford's study, Roman Cyprus. We certainly see Phoenician being utilized in inscriptions in the classical period, and then down in the Hellenistic period. And then interestingly, we do have instances in Kition, which is, the particular city, the landscape in Cyprus that particularly is connected with Phoenician culture and society. We certainly see inscriptions being reused and reinscribed with Phoenician on them. And I don't necessarily think that's a mistake. There might be something quite deliberate going on there, but I don't read Phoenician. I don't translate the language, so that's something I'd have to turn to colleagues and peers who work on this to get a better sense of what might be going on there.
Speaking of Mitford, he had suggested that Cypriots eagerly pursued citizenship, but
Hmm.
became disenchanted when they didn't achieve it and
Yes.
began to look inwards. What's your take on that?
Yeah, this argument is this idea is really based on an empire-wide phenomenon that occurs in AD 212. We have the Edict of Caracalla, so the Constitutio Antoniniana, and this is a really important legal document, and there are of course lots of controversies and different interpretations about how people view this, but the key takeaway point is that this granted citizenship to all freeborn people in the provinces, and based on that, Mitford noted that the lack of individuals appearing in inscriptions using key imperial nomenclature, so the name Aurelii, meant that they just weren't bothered anymore with pursuing citizenship. One, because those who are freeborn had been granted it automatically, but then we get this disenchantment with it. So that's one thing. The other thing is also because the way in which citizenship is granted in Cyprus is that it's just really sporadic, and there's no rhyme or reason, because we get lots of families where they're clearly, or individuals who are clearly doing things that are getting them noticed and they're really prominent. They might not necessarily be granted citizenship straight away or at all, compared to some who are. So I think that's where his conclusions from that come from. But the thing is, there's several things to remark upon here. So my take is that we can't really argue from silence. Just because we can't see something doesn't necessarily mean that we can draw a conclusion that people were disenchanted or no longer proud of seeking citizenship or wanting it. So that's one thing that's really problematic. The other thing is our the archaeological record from Cyprus is uneven. We haven't brought this into any discussion yet, but it's the island is divided, and there are incredible leaps and bounds that have been made southern side of the island in terms of the archaeology and the collaborations that have taken place. And it's phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal to see how this has grown over many decades. But that is not the same for the north of the island. So I'm always mindful that we have a very uneven archaeological record. And I'm always hopeful that that there are things that haven't been uncovered. So I'm very reluctant to draw firm conclusions that are based on silences in the material record. So I sort of I sort of thought maybe dial that conclusion back
Yeah.
a little bit. And we certainly see after AD 212, we still see people being enthusiastic for their cities, and they're, particularly that evidence of individuals operating outside the island. They're still keenly participating in those cultural events of empire. So there's a lot more to take on board than just thinking about the specifics of the nomenclature that we see.
So as you might know, I had an interview with Andrew Wilburn,
Hmm.
and we talked about the Cypriot curse tablets.
Yes.
Uh, you look at these tablets through the lens of social interaction, and there's actually even evidence of proconsuls being cursed by
Yes.
locals. So, what can we take from that? Does this suggest tension amongst the local populace and Roman governance, or is this just like a little isolated event? I mean, how do you interpret that?
Well, I'm so glad you brought this up because it's a really great piece of evidence from the island, and we have these documents that they're legal in nature, and they tell us, how individuals wished for their enemies to be tongue-tied and confused when they're in court. And so you have the names of individuals sort of scribed in. It's like a fill in the blanks exercise with a practitioner overseeing the creation of the bulk of the text themselves. So we have this snapshot where a governor is cursed. And this speaks to a couple of things, really. One is that I really felt it was important to make a big deal of this type of evidence because the epigraphic evidence, our monumental inscriptions, they really dominate our viewpoint when we're exploring aspects of Roman culture and society in the Cypriot context. And that gives us the positive snapshots. That really tells us of the wonderful things and the wonderful interactions that people are engaging with, and those positive dynamics between prominent locals or groups or institutions and administrators. And the administrators are there representing the state, so representing the emperor himself. So, of course, that's going to be positive. Both sides want to gain something from this negotiation or these types of interactions. So, there's something reciprocal here to bear in mind. With the curse tablets, we don't have that. This is, in fact, an unofficial document. And we've got, all kinds of ideas about how curses were made and the conditions in which they took place and were created and deposited. And the fact that we have a governor or proconsul being cursed just tells us about other aspects of the administrators' responsibilities on the island. They were essentially there to do a whole host of things, and one thing would be presiding over local legal concerns. So it doesn't, of course, we have no idea whether the individual or individuals placing these curses, whether they are guilty, innocent, or whatever they've been accused of. But it just gives us a little bit of a paradigm shift when we're thinking about those dynamics and interactions. So it's a nice little snapshot of nuance when it comes to thinking about local communities and individuals interacting with officials from Rome.
There's this really famous. Well, I think anyone who knows the Bank of Cyprus, they'll
Yes.
recognize a very famous logo, I suppose, called Koinon Kyprion. It's quite a common image, but admittedly, I have no idea what it is. And this emerges in this period. I guess a loose translation would be Confederacy of Cypriots.
Yeah. Yes.
So what let's figure out what is the Koinon Kyprion for
Yes.
us on the outside.
Yeah, this is a really prominent and important local institution, and of course we see these replicated in different landscapes across the Mediterranean. So Cyprus is not unique in having their own koinon or kinon. It's thought to have been founded under Ptolemaic rule, but really the evidence comes, relating to their activities comes into its own under Roman rule, and really shows the range of their responsibilities and actions during this time. So, some of the things that we certainly see them doing, they set up monuments to prominent Romans outside the island. That's one key thing that they do. So, in particular, governors, ex governors or ex proconsuls. So, again, it's all about maintaining that dynamic, that relationship, thinking what they can get out of this network to benefit local interests. We really see them rewarding locals for benefactions and for their sort of enthusiasm and zeal, towards their own cities. So we get certain individuals being rewarded. Under Claudius, they're given the responsibility of minting coins for the island. So that relates to the point you've just made, Andreas, about that symbol that's really well known to Cypriots today. So we certainly see that as prominent, a prominent hangover from the ancient world. Essentially, their role was to make sure that they had a role of negotiating peace, of negotiating potentially awkward dynamics between cities, or on behalf of cities and other players that came into contact with Cyprus, and essentially just to ensure that Cyprus as an island was best represented and rewarded accordingly on the regional and of course on the wider Mediterranean stage as well. So just some examples to drill down a little bit more. Again, this is Cicero blowing his own trumpet. Really, he boasts that when he's governor of Cilicia in 51 BC, he boasts that unlike his predecessors, he refused a bribe of 200 talents, and he talks about how the koinon or Kynon were instrumental in negotiating there. So we get this sense that when during this unstable period, when we have administrators coming into contact with Rome, so following on from the annexation in 58 BC, initially Cyprus was governed as part of Cilicia, so in southern Asia Minor. So the Kynon, the koinon, they essentially were there to first of all get in there straight away and negotiate some sort of relationship with the Roman administrator that was taking control. And this was obviously done through a bribe of some sort. So that's one thing we see. We've mentioned the oath of allegiance before, and there's some idea that Koinon itself was involved in the creation of that, or certainly the text in some way. The key thing about this particular local institution is that one of its most important functions was overseeing the cult of the ruler, so the worship of the emperor, and
Mhm.
maintaining that during the Roman period. Again, like the negotiatores, unlike other periods and other contexts rather, we don't have specifics about this group. We don't know exactly who gained membership, how this was managed in the Cypriot context. But we should certainly imagine that the most prominent and the highest ranking of elites of the cities themselves made part of this, this group, this institution.
Yeah, you mentioned that they even sent an embassy to Rome in
Yes,
22 AD to secure the right of asylum by the island's oldest sanctuaries.
yes,
Inscriptions set up in Olympia and Capua.
yeah,
So definitely, you can. I guess the evidence is small, but it's there, and
yeah.
it's interesting about how far and wide that they made their mark felt.
Yes, absolutely. And they're doing everything that they can to make sure that Cyprus as an island gets the best deal that it can really out of being part of this particular imperial system. I think that really speaks to some aspects of ancient Cyprus as a landscape generally. We started this conversation by thinking about its resources and how it was exploited, and thinking about the island paradox. It's this highly connected landscape, but it's isolated as well. And I say in the book, in many ways, because of these things and how it was perceived, it was fated to be conquered. And the Cypriots, they're not passive. I really don't see them as a passive community. They use every tool they possibly can to do what they can to negotiate, and, as I say, make the best of the situation, and see what they can benefit out of it. You get this sense of being, really practical and savvy in the face of managing lots of difficult political allegiances and dynamics.
It's really interesting that you brought up that word passive. In every interview I've conducted up to this point, it's always amazing how much agency actually exists in Cyprus. There's never a
Yes.
period of time. Unfortunately, though, it is portrayed that way in a lot of popular literature. But
Hmm.
I just had an interview recently with Luca Zavagno. He is a professor of Byzantine studies, and we talked about the Arab raids in Cyprus and the
Yes.
establishment of a condominium. And it was just fascinating to talk to him, to learn about how much agency actually existed in Cyprus, how key Cypriot delegations were in negotiating the terms. It's not like they were just, again, there's that word, they weren't passive in all this. They were actually quite active in advocating for themselves and getting the best for Cyprus and Cypriots. So if there's a common thread in any of these talks, it's that there's certainly lots of agency in Cyprus. I love to hear that. I really love to hear that. It's interesting. On a side note here, that there's no independent temple that was set up
Mhm.
to honor the emperors. Is it fair to say that they were just simply kind of co-opted into existing cults?
Yes. I mean, I think this speaks to a few points that we made earlier and touched upon. I mean, one thing you asked me was, what changes do we see, and I sort of said, well, yes, of course we get, this enthusiastic response to the emperor and his worship in the island, but yeah, we don't see an independent temple really being set up to him, and I think that gives us that sense that, again, it's in many ways a veneer. They're
Hmm.
doing the right things at the right times in the right ways to, show the enthusiasm and the leaning into, Roman systems, Roman symbols, and of course, that we see that at varying intensities. But the local and, roots and connections that exist before continue, and they essentially take the prime role. So again, when we think about particular landscapes in Cyprus, you've got the cult of Aphrodite at Paphos, so Aphrodite Paphia. Again, we generally hear how unusual and unique and particular that particular setup is there, and how ancient it is, and that's not compromised. Of course, we have monuments to the emperor and his wider household really being set up, really, straight off the bat, with in great volume. And we see monuments to members of the imperial household, including things like a dedication to Livia, the wife of Emperor Augustus, and it's Livia as Aphrodite. But it's an inscription, it's not a temple, it doesn't alter, as far as we know, the shape of the sanctuary. As I say, we don't know, because there's the ruins of the sanctuary give little away about certain aspects of how that particular space was inhabited and visited by people. Again, you've got the worship of Apollo Hylates at Koinon. This is the chief deity there, and we get the adoption of the imperial cult there. But so we have dedications to Apollo Hylates and Apollo Caesar together. but Apollo Caesar always comes second to Apollo Hylates, and it's so we see it being worship of the emperor being assumed, but it doesn't dramatically alter what's happening in these locations. The only place that it really changes is at Amathus, because we see this huge rebuilding of temples and the Acropolis there in the latter half of the 1st century AD. That seems to be driven by a particular Roman governor. So we see things being changed quite dramatically there, but still we get this sense that really what came before is maintained and not forgotten, and it continues.
This lack of clear honor for the emperors, would you say it's an example of, or it could be interpreted as an example of passive resistance, or would you just say it's an example of indifference?
I wouldn't necessarily call it passive resistance, because I think there is genuine enthusiasm for the worship of the emperor.
Okay.
We certainly get, we get individuals who aren't, we don't even know if they're rewarded in any way or given citizenship, what really happens other than this snapshot. But we get all kinds of shrines being set up, and I think there is genuine enthusiasm, but we also have to bear in mind that when it comes to how institutions in Cyprus operate, so beyond a lone individual, and I'm thinking in particular of the oath of allegiance to Tiberius, there's something at stake here. There's something, the worship of the emperor and making, the local context, making that connection with Aphrodite, their chief deity, being the divine ancestress of the emperor. There's something to be gained from that. And of course, there's something to be gained from individuals really throwing themselves into acting as priests of the imperial cult in different contexts, and ensuring that festivals are, worshipping and honoring him. And as I've mentioned with Servius Sulpicius Pancles Boranianus, setting up statues to the emperor, that kind of activity gets them noticed, and it puts them in many ways in contact with local administrators, and of course that's a vehicle for them to then have that contact outside of the island and utilize that network. So I do think there's genuine enthusiasm. Your other descriptor, what was it? Sorry, you said passive resistance or indifference. Yeah. No, I don't think they're indifferent at all. As I say, I think there's something to be gained here. So yeah, absolutely.
Are there I wish I had your book in front of me, because you had a list of names there, epigraphic inscriptions, and a lot of them have Greek cognomens.
Yes.
What is that? How is that interpreted? What does that imply? The fact that we have these Roman names and then with like a Greek name right at the end.
Yeah.
Are these examples of enfranchised individuals?
Yes, absolutely. We have this. It's really wonderful, because when we turn to our key cities, key settlements under Rome, we get particular hubs where a lot of epigraphic evidence tells us about different family dynamics and the perhaps the role and the impact of citizenship in Cyprus in different contexts. And just circling back really to Mitford's work, I think Mitford does get he gets quite a bit of criticism traditionally from some quarters, but actually I really would like to use the opportunity to say that his work is phenomenal. It spans from the 1930s until the 1990s, and he died in the late 1970s, and his work was, we've got key works that are published posthumously, but he made accessible scores and scores of inscriptions from Ptolemaic and Roman Cyprus, and he really is that important foundation stone from which all of our work on these periods is building from. And a lot of what he said does stand today. It's really important to say that. And his study on the Roman citizenship, apart from the nuances that I mentioned with regards how to, regarding how to interpret specifics of that, but a lot of it does stand today. So we can turn to our key hubs such as, Paphos, Kition, Kyprion, and Salamis, and we can see the prominent rise of certain family groups that dominate the local administrative and particularly religious scene. And these individuals have all kinds of names. They adopt, those that gain citizenship adopt the Roman trianomina. They have a praenomen, nomen, and cognomen. But some also have this extra name as well. So the cognomen, for those who have the traditional three parts to their names, they maintain that Greek name that they have that reflects their family or their family ties, and then the other parts are Roman, that come from perhaps the person who granted them citizenship, or the system, for the emperor from which that system from which that came from. Sorry. But maintaining that Greek cognomen is really important to show that people, that their identity was fluid and situational. And there's one particular family from Paphos and Paphos. We see them there operating a lot. The Umidi of Paphos, as I call them. We've got one particular individual from that family, Gaius Umidius Quadratus, and he's also known as Pantalkianos. So, he's named in that way in his inscriptions. And, you've got a Tiberius Claudius Rhodocles, also known as Stasicrates. So they're keeping, in their inscriptions, they're making these nods to other locally significant names by which they're known by. So again, it's all this where do we strike the balance when we're thinking about how much did people lean into celebrating and embracing being part of the Roman Empire, and how much did they hold on to what came before? They didn't just forget that they had ties and connections with communities and landscapes locally and across the region just because they were assumed into the Roman Empire. It was a very careful balancing act, and we see them maintaining it in this way. It's really, really creative and exciting to see.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It really is, and it's not the first time that we've seen this in Cyprus either. I know that in the archaic, pretty sure it's the archaic era, we have names in the epigraphic record of Phoenician names, and then on the other hand, that same
Yes,
person is written as a Greek name as well. And there's a lot of, I
absolutely.
suppose, I don't know, what do we call it? Code switching,
Yeah,
way of
yeah.
kind of navigating the political and cultural landscape of Cyprus. It's really fascinating. It really is.
It is, and I mean, there's particularly with this family that I've mentioned from the Paphian context. They've got individuals who make it clear that they've got ancestors or family members, and they name them. So we've got someone who crops up a lot, and we get the name Tukros that crops up a lot. So I sort of think, well, of course, that's Tuka, and
Right.
Tuka is an incredibly important local figure, mythologically in Cyprus, and
The
it's
founder of
there's
Thalamus, right?
yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. So there's I don't think that the use and choice of these names, these symbols and signs, there, it's not by accident.
Yeah.
I certainly don't think so.
I do have one more question for you, and this one I think you've actually published a separate paper on this that I came across. Can you just tell us one final thing? Can you speak to Lucius Septimius Nestor of Loranda and
Hmm.
his benefactor, Sergia Aurelia Regina, at the sanctuary of Aphrodite Paphia? Because there was an inscription that was found commemorating him as a poet, and
Yeah.
he was even granted citizenship. What drew you to that find, and what's so significant about it?
Oh, this is such a delightful interaction, I would say. And it's a brilliant snapshot of a high profile visitor coming to the island and perhaps staying there for a while. And the figure that you mentioned, Sergia Aurelia Regina, she's a sort of a self-styled consularis femina in Cyprus. So she is somebody of high rank in the local scene, or on the local scene. And we've got two inscriptions from the Sanctuary of Aphrodite Paphia at Paphos that name or indicate that this dynamic between the two of them. So they're statue basis. So we should imagine somehow that there was, an accompanying statue that sort of went hand in hand with the inscriptions. We don't have those, unfortunately. What is really fun about this interaction? So Regina is the patroness, and Nestor of Loranda is this infamous poet, and we see him crop up in lots of different places in the Roman Empire. So this interaction in Cyprus really contributes to the wider cultural scene at this time. And there's a particular thing about these inscriptions that I just want to mention, because it's great fun to see this playing out in stone. So as I've mentioned, there's a statue or statue base that shows that Regina sets up a monument commemorating Nestor of Loranda. And she describes herself as I've mentioned, a consularis femina. So she is of mighty stock. So that's the phrase. Now, one might expect to see the Greek word hypatike, used as the equivalent to consularis femina. But instead, we see the phrase hypate hypaton, and that's the name of a musical note from the greater perfect system. So this would have been commonly known in antiquity. And what is significant about this, and I hope I get this right, saying it out loud, is that the note that she uses to describe her rank and her identity, it would have been played using a string on the highest position of an instrument, but it would have in fact made the lowest sounding, timbre or sound. So she's signaling her rank as being high, but her musical proficiency as being low, and of course inferior to the great poet that she is the patroness of. Anyone reading this would have got that pun. And what is really nice about these two inscriptions is that the other inscription is not 100% clear, but I would certainly say there's lots of markers there to indicate that it was set up by Nestor to her. And it makes me think about the display of these inscriptions in a context like the Sanctuary of Aphrodite at Paphos. I mean, anyone who's visited there, it's you just get a sense of the foundations today. It's a site that's been rebuilt on and utilized over many centuries, and lots of material from the site have of course been displaced as well. So I sort of hedge my bets a little bit with the article that you mentioned. And I like to think that really the inscriptions, they would have been set up next to one another, or at least in close proximity, because the stones speak to one another, and you'd like to think that that's how they could have been viewed in the ancient world in that setting. As I say, there's no firm evidence for this. This is not like other contexts where we have a really clear example of exactly where inscriptions were set up in proximity to one another. But I'd like to think that relationship and the joke and the pun was clear for passers-by, or people certainly interacting in that context to see.
Ersin, thank you so much. Honestly, this was great. This was really insightful, and even just talking with you today, I feel like I already know so much more than I thought I did going into this. There's a lot of clarity, and again, I don't know how else I can say it. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much, Andreas. This is such a wonderful series, and I feel really honoured and quite humbled that you've asked me to be part of this. And I really hope I've done justice to the Roman period. There's so much to say about this this stretch of history in the island's profile. So I really hope this encourages people to go off, find out more, go into their museums, find out online what other resources there are, engage with the key texts that we talk about. Of course, there's so much more as well that listeners can engage with when it comes to Cyprus in the ancient imagination during this period as well. So yeah, I really hope it is it's encouraging and inspiring for people to hear about this.
There's another thing that I also found in our conversation that really kind of lends itself to another theme that I found that's kind of running through these episodes, and that is dispelling a lot of common misconceptions about Cyprus. And
Absolutely, yeah.
And yeah, this is just like another tick, talking about Roman Cyprus.
Fantastic. Well, keep up the amazing work.
Thank you, Ersin. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great evening.
Yes, and you. Thank you so much again. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.